It feels so good to be bad. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Rodriguez-Dolman and Eminem has dropped the Death of Slim Shady, and man, I'm here to give you my thoughts on the album. Not really going to go into like a proper full out review or anything. These are just my thoughts, my feelings, my opinions. I'm not taking on board anything that's been said on the internet, from NFR, from Twitter. I ain't taking anyone else's thoughts into consideration, except maybe Versatile Variety, who I've spoken to a lot about it. But these are my thoughts on the Death of Slim Shady. Before I get into it though, make sure to press that subscribe button because I am on the road to 1,000 subscribers. I tend to make a lot of vinyl related videos, especially hip hop vinyl, showing off my collection there. So if you could do me that little favour, that'd be great. And also go in the comments, let me know your thoughts on the Death of Slim Shady. So let me begin by sort of giving you my first thoughts on the project and like the overview, I guess. And I'm just gonna say, this is a great Eminem album. I think a lot of people are going to come out and be like, oh, this is the best project he's done in the past decade. I'd argue with that. But let's talk about since 2017, because I think there's an argument from there. I think Music to Be Murdered By is honestly quite slept on by like outside the Eminem community. Obviously Revival had a lot of issues. Kamikaze was a great follow-up, and if I'm being real, I don't think he's released anything bad since Revival. But I would be lying if I was telling you that I didn't think that the Death of Slim Shady was the best album he's done in that time period since Revival. This project is amazing. I love the concept around it. I love the songs that are on it. I love the throwbacks in there. There is a lot to enjoy on this album. And I think one of the main talking points for me to sort of say about is kind of that whole throwback with the voice and everything like that, because the second he started rapping on Renaissance, I kind of like, my eyes widened and my jaw dropped, because holy shit, this is the classic Slim Shady voice. But man, it was such a moment to hear that classic Slim Shady voice. Like genuinely, I think it took everyone back. And I think it was the moment everyone went, oh shit, this is different. So looking at this project just overall, there is something very magical about this album. And like, some people might try and throw in the argument, oh, it's nostalgia bait and whatnot. I disagree. I think it's almost homage to his old previous stuff whilst making it feel brand new. And I think one of the things that I want to touch on is like, I think something taken like Revival, for example, I'm not going to keep going back to it, but with Revival, I think he was trying to appeal everyone with having like, basically taking every album he's done and putting at least 1 or 2, maybe 3 songs from each project essentially, or the style of each project he's done, and tried putting it on one album that kind of like didn't work. Whereas what he's done here on Death of Slim Shady is he's almost taken the best Slim Shady elements from each Slim Shady based album and put them on this, which gave it more focus, adding a nostalgia element to it that doesn't just make you feel like, oh, you're just using that to just get me to listen. It was more, you got me to listen and also super enjoy it and make it feel brand new. Like on this project, you literally get a past Eminem, like from an unreleased track on Encore, and it's not just treated as like a bonus track from the vaults, here you go. It's actually used to blend into the story that is being told across the album, and gives you probably one of my favorite songs on the album. I mean, when I first listened to this was a song I had just on repeat by itself, coming from someone who is a very Relapse heavy Eminem fan. Obviously I know it is an Encore based song, but I feel like Encore was like the predecessor to what Relapse became. And obviously Relapse is where I think you get a lot more of the Christopher Reeve shit. But you also get a bit of Relapse within Lucifer. You get touches of the Marshall Mathers LP, obviously with Antichrist when you have Bizarre on there. Almost recreating, I think, what Amityville did. I think that's the right song. And of course you obviously get Slim Shady LP sprinkled all throughout this. Plus, you actually get some of, say, like Music to Be Murdered By type of Eminem put on here with stuff like Head Honcho, kind of like after Guilty Conscience 2, that's where I feel like you get like modern Eminem. And if I'm being fair, that's some of his best stuff he's done in like the modern era of Eminem. So overall, this is a fantastic Eminem album. Obviously, like, we got a launch for this. I haven't even mentioned that. We had a launch for this album, which we haven't had in like the past 3 years, or at least 3 releases, sorry. And it was perfectly executed. You even get the Hot Tub meme, which, I mean, kind of funny, kind of not. I think it was more funny Eminem jumped on a trend of a meme, or at least like his social media manager was like, hey, we should put this on here. We also got trailers. Somehow the cover was actually built into the Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre promotion for Gin and Juice. Houdini was an amazing single, the perfect single for this album, with an incredible music video. Toby was where I think people kind of went, oh shit, is this actually gonna be a bad release? Toby's not a bad song. I think the problem is it shouldn't have been a single, but I think the reason it more was a single was so then Eminem could like throw a bit more spotlight on Big Sean and Baby Tron, almost passing the torch to them a little bit, because it is like essentially the outro track to what the Death of Slim Shady album is. So the fact we even got a launch with this album instead of just the regular surprise drop he's done for at least the past like technically 3 albums, or like 2 albums plus side B, it really enhanced the experience that we had with this in terms of building up hype and everything, and I feel like it really brought that extra thing to make this album feel as good as it is. So now I just want to talk about my favourite songs on this album, because there are quite a few. And I'll just say that as well, I don't actually think there's really a miss on this album. I'm not just going to go through and say every song was like my favourite or anything, but I'll just go through the couple. I feel like Habits was really like, obviously you get Renaissance, which is like a good way to start a project, but it's not really like a song you're going to like put on to listen to, which is why I think Habits is more like the perfect way to start the album with like your first proper song. And the hook by White Gold just brings that song together really nicely. But Brand New Dance, as I kind of mentioned, that was the song I had on repeat a lot at first. That was definitely the nostalgia bait that got me. However, since however many listens I've had of this album now, Brand New Dance is still one of my favourites, but I think others have now gone above it in my personal ranking. Lucifer is probably the song that's becoming one of my favourites of it as well. The hook by Sly Piper, I think is his name, is something that just really captivates me, and that's something I will say as I go through like some of the other songs. There's this really like mafia kind of like underground gangsters kind of vibe to it, especially with a song like Head Honcho. Like I really like some of the vibe coming out of it, like that like mafia boss Eminem sort of going on here, which is kind of ironic considering how that's more how he looked like style wise in Music to Be Murdered By. I get a lot of that mafia energy from some of these tracks, and Lucifer's hook has that, but Lucifer as a song, it's modern day Relapse, and I'm always going to take more of that. And straight away following that track you get Antichrist, and I feel like that's such a perfect like combo of songs to put next to each other. And I think Antichrist for me actually gives me a lot of Marshall Mathers LP 1 vibes, especially as you get the Bizarre feature on there. And then you get Fuel with Jid on it, who goes fucking crazy. And I think that's the person who's getting the most praise from his feature. I actually prefer another feature over Jid's. I'm not saying I didn't like Jid's, but they still both went off, and Jid, incredible verse. I'm kind of really glad we almost got like at least one of the dream features from Eminem and someone like more from the modern rap era. Kind of wish there was a J. Cole somewhere on this album, but that's just still going to have to be one of those dream collabs. At least we got one of them with Jid and Eminem on this, and I think that was something that was teased with the Doomsday Part 2 music video. And I think Fuel as a song is one of those songs that people are going to have in their playlist rotating through. Houdini, we've already kind of spoken about it in my video where I reacted to the song, but just to summarize it, I think it was the perfect song to kind of help elevate this album up in terms of having that kind of hit on the album. And I feel like that's something that's I feel like that's the magic that's been missing from a fair few of the previous Eminem albums that have come out. Like you look at the trilogy that came from Eminem with Slim Shady LP, Marshall Mathers LP, and also the Eminem Show. Why did I forget that? Yeah, My Name Is, The Real Slim Shady, and Without Me. Those are like the 3 like top Eminem singles in my opinion. You can throw Lose Yourself, blah blah blah, there's a lot of others, but like you had to have that one track that did have more of the mainstream Eminem radio play, and Houdini provided that for the Death of Slim Shady. Like I got in the car the other day, and I don't ever listen to the radio, but I had just like gone to pick a parcel up or something, I got back in the car and Houdini was playing, and I was like, holy shit. And then it was quite funny when you get to the end of the second verse, and then it's literally almost silent with how much they had to bleep it. I think for me at the moment, Houdini is more of a skip, just because I've overplayed it and I just want to listen to the newer shit. Guilty Conscience 2, love the track, I love the concept of it, comes to the concept in a minute. The whole discussion between Eminem and Slim Shady, I love. I've got to say, I've got to be careful with how I bring this on, because I think both songs, the one I'm about to bring up, and Guilty Conscience Part 2, they're doing 2 very different things in terms of what they're actually talking about, because Guilty Conscience 2 is more about the Slim Shady character and how Eminem or Marshall Mathers perceives that character and how immature he is. I love the conversation that happens in that. I also love the kind of like taking your expectation and almost outdoing it. Because I think when I first saw the track list that there was going to be a Guilty Conscience Part 2, I was fully expecting Dre on it. I was fully expecting the whole sort of story kind of supposed to be similar to what they did in the Slim Shady LP. We're taking like 3 different scenarios but applying them to modern day, probably adding the sort of like internet thing, maybe putting a catfish in there, some kind of thing like that. I was thinking that Eminem might go down, but to actually make the guilty conscience thing being his own conscience and like feeling guilty for what he's done using Slim Shady, fucking love that idea. I just have to say, I do prefer My Darling as the kind of like Eminem talking to Slim Shady sort of thing. Granted, maybe that Slim Shady voice in My Darling isn't as obvious, but I do like the characterization of Slim Shady more in Guilty Conscience Part 2 rather than My Darling. However, I just prefer listening to My Darling over Guilty Conscience Part 2. That's just a personal thing. Head Honcho, I was listening to this on my drive today, and that one, the first one I listened to, I was like, whatever. Now I fucking love that song. I think that's going up like in my top 3 on this album. And that's who I was speaking about earlier when talking about Jid. I actually personally prefer Easy Mill's performance over JID. I mean, not only because, but I feel like probably because Easy Mill added a bit of something to the hook. Maybe that kind of like elevates his performance a little bit more. But like he also starts speaking Filipino in his verse and everything like that. Like I think there's a lot that Easy Mill has added to the song of Head Honcho that, I'm not saying Jid didn't add anything to Fuel, but like I just really prefer Easy Mill's performance over JID's. I know I kept flipping between Jid and JID there, but whatever. Especially coming from someone who raps as ORD, who calls me Ord. That'd be weird. I don't know. You know, I said I wasn't going to go through every song as like being my favourite, but I've basically gone through most of them. But then we get all of that like amazing characterization, cartoony sort of thing, and like that kind of almost some horror vibe, and just like that fun, whatever you want to think of typical Slim Shady. And then you're hit with Temporary. And what I'm about to say is going to be more of a compliment to the song than it might sound. I have to skip it every time. That doesn't sound like a compliment, but it actually is for me, because when I first heard it, it made me cry. It was a beautiful song. Skylar Grey brings an amazing hook to the song. There's a little bit of cheesiness to it. There's also a reference to Slim Shady LP where he talks about death, and it's a beautiful song in the sense of Eminem talking about when he's gone, which is ironic talking about the other song that he did, but it's talking about him dying and his message to Haley. The way that the song's performed brings tears to my eyes, not just because of the whole Eminem, oh, fuck's sake. I actually fucking thought I wouldn't tear up myself speaking about this, but anyway, the point I was going to get to is it's not just because it's like Eminem speaking about, fuck. The fact I'm fucking tearing up, just trying to say what I'm trying to say is the reason I have to like skip the song just when I hear it, because I lost my dad about 2 years ago, and it kind of makes me. This is like the most ugliest part of this video. I'm sorry, I'm being a fucking pussy crying about this, but like, it makes me think about what he would say to me. That in like his. I don't even know how to fucking apply it to the song. Just, it makes me think about what he would try to say to me now he's gone, and that whole thing. That, I just want to leave that there. That's a giant reason why I can't listen to the song, because it brings my own sort of like thoughts and feelings and yada yada. Anyway, moving on. We're not getting depressed in this. We're talking about a great album. After that, you're just hit with Bad Ones, which to me feels a bit like Eminem and White Gold had a bunch of songs that they did during the Music to Be Murdered By stuff, and this was like another extra on to throw in there. A good one to sort of like end off the sort of fun vibes that we kind of like get from most of this project. We get the return of Ken Kenneth, so a thumbs up there. And then you're left with another fucking high emotional song from Eminem, which does make me cry in a different way. But it's basically like, I think Eminem's been wanting to do those sort of songs, or at least have a song that people kind of go, oh fuck, that made me cry sort of thing, because he had this song essentially at the end of Revival. And I think because a lot of people just didn't get to the end of Revival, they don't realise Eminem did this sort of take where he was like talking about his life, or talking about his fatherhood and what it would have meant if he had like overdosed and died. So I almost feel like he wanted to have that song where people almost paid attention to, which is why I put Somebody Save Me at the end of this track list. Another beautiful song. I practically talked about almost the whole track list there. There's a lot of positives to come from this. There's a lot that I'm just gonna like take and put in my playlist. So really good to see that from an Eminem track list and album. If I were to give you my top 3 right now currently for this album, off like the first weekend of me listening, I'm gonna say Lucifer, Head Honcho, and what would be my third? Fuck it, Brand New Dance. I love Brand New Dance. Habits would be kind of like the number 4, and then for the top 5, Houdini. I think those are the top 5 off this for me. I've kind of skimmed over it a bit because I wanted to dedicate a kind of almost little section to this in this video as a chapter, but the concept of the album, I love it. To a certain extent, I'll throw that in there. So obviously the whole point of this is essentially Slim Shady's come back, almost like split himself from Eminem, or is like the past, like kind of how they showed in the Houdini video where he's jumping through the portal and coming back and meeting Eminem, and then they have this almost like fight between each other. That's almost the full concept, but in this what you kind of learn, especially through the last trailer he put out in the lead up to the album being released, was essentially Slim Shady has kidnapped Eminem, tied him up in the basement, and is almost just having this conversation with him about cancel culture, offending people, and the fact that without Slim Shady, Eminem would not be where he is, and Marshall Mathers should be thankful for Slim Shady, and Slim Shady is almost trying to show Marshall that Marshall still needs him. And it's quite ironic because he almost proves his point. Like, that's one of my takeaways from it, because it's almost like this is what people are calling one of Eminem's best albums in the last, some people are saying decade, I would argue that. And a lot of that is because a lot of the high praise on this album up till say Guilty Conscience Part 2, most of that track list up until then is Slim Shady taking over and making a lot of the most high praise songs on the album. But stepping outside of the concept just for a second and sort of going outside the fourth wall, Eminem's the one who still produced it at the end of the day. He's still the one who wrote the raps for it. So in a sense, yes, Slim Shady is the one who's like made some of the best shit on this album. It's still Eminem at the end of the day. He's still the one who's put this thing together and made it as good as it was. Obviously added with the beats and the producers and everything, but like, it's still Eminem's project. But he's just used Slim Shady to kind of tell the story a bit better. But jumping back into the concept, that whole thing with kind of like Slim Shady trying to be offensive, trying to get cancelled, that whole thing, Marshall Mathers / Eminem actually challenges all of that and says like, I mean, Guilty Conscience Part 2 is the most obvious way of where he's saying it. I think the perfect example outside of Guilty Conscience Part 2 is actually Trouble, because one of the most clever ways I think Eminem's shown this is actually through ad-libs, because you get Slim Shady does the rapping and then the ad-libs are just Eminem being like, what the fuck, or why are you saying that? And I feel like that's a really good way to like show that concept and bring that concept to another level. And I think that kind of helps, that's an extra thing that elevates this album, because say if we look at Music to Be Murdered By, right, just side A in this instance, you get the kind of Alfred Hitchcock sort of skits and stuff thrown on there. And whilst I think you could do like a deep dive into Music to Be Murdered By and you might find that story, I personally wouldn't say there's like that story you follow through or anything at all. It's almost just like Eminem's murdering beats. That's the sort of story as such I would put to it. And I'm just going to acknowledge now, this isn't a Music to Be Murdered By video, so I'm doing that as like a surface level analysis. There's so much more you can go into there, but that's from a surface level. If you're looking at Death of Slim Shady from a surface level, the concept is very obvious. There's a very obvious story to follow that again has layers to it, and I feel like that story for Death of Slim Shady really adds to this album and makes it more so worth listening to. So I've got some high praise for the concept of this album. Love it. Kind of transitioning into my next sort of thing now. Does this album have any lows? Now this first one I'm going to link into the previous thing I've gone over, which is the concept, and I said that I love it to a certain extent. Now that certain extent is that the whole kind of idea of the cancelling Eminem thing and the sort of like Gen Z are trying to cancel Eminem on this album, sometimes I feel like it's a little bit too overdone or a bit much, and even in some of the ways that Slim Shady is trying to be cancelled or trying to be offensive, in some elements I think it's like perfectly done if you're trying to be offensive, like say with like Road Rage and talking about the fatness sort of thing, or adding the sort of little people midgets slander that's thrown in there sometimes. But one of the things I kind of find with it is if you're trying to talk about being cancelled and you're trying to go all out on there, which again is its own conversation of yes, he's trying to go all out, but at the same time there is a part of it where he isn't trying to overdo it. But if you are trying to make this concept come to life a bit more, there's really repetitive elements that are brought up, like the trans stuff. He brings up Bruce Jenner quite a lot. Meg Thee Stallion's brought up again by Bizarre, and I'm not saying it's too repetitive or whatnot, but there's quite a few points like that are repeated a few times. Like, it's again with the Christopher Reeve stuff, like obviously the Encore and Relapse era really did this, where it's almost just being offensive about one thing over and over again. It's like, it gets to a point where it's almost like, is that the only thing you can really say? And I feel like this is going to be the criticism that will come from this album after a month or two, that people will go, hang on a minute, is this becoming a bit of a parody of Slim Shady? And right now I want to say I don't agree with that. I don't think it is. I think it's perfectly executed. I can see that becoming a question that is brought up into conversations a bit more down the line. But I think for what this concept of the project is trying to do, he's not actually trying to get cancelled. That's not the point of it. Like, obviously for one, you can't cancel Eminem. But point two, Eminem's own point of this album is you should respect people and people should be able to live their own lives. And trying to be offensive and have these just messed up opinions and being controversial isn't necessarily right. That's what he's saying, despite everything else he has said in the past, through the outlet of that Slim Shady character. So that was just a little criticism I wanted to look at from that sort of angle of the concept. Looking at some of the songs, I don't think there's too much to really criticize about it. Looking at the songs and the track list, I actually don't think there is a lot to criticize. I think Eminem's verses are perfect, like in terms of all the different flows, all the different like bars he has. That P. Diddy bar I think is probably the one I'm not going to say love the most, but I think is the most outstanding bar on there. He didn't just miss out a P. Diddy. I'm not even going to reference the rest of that, which comes prior. Like, Eminem's verses on everything he's done has never been bad. Encore is probably the only place you can probably find some of that stuff where it is bad. However, I think what has been bad with his verses and his music in the past is that he's always been good at rapping, but slowing it down sometimes or just being able to provide a different element to it in recent years, I think has been a major complaint. And on this project, there's no problem with his verses at all. Now, when it comes to hooks, I feel like that's where there's been more of an issue in the past with Eminem. And I don't actually feel like this criticism is gonna come up much. But if I compare this to something like Relapse, Relapse always has, I can't think of any other real example on there other than We Made You. But Eminem was always prominent on the hooks. And I know Relapse is not anywhere near a perfect album. It's got flaws, it's definitely too messed up to be a commercial success, even though it is a commercial success, if that makes sense. I think I mean that from the sense of like, a casual Eminem mainstream music listener is not going to be listening to Relapse. Hardcore Eminem fans or stans, we are listening to Relapse because we fucking love that, despite how messed up it is. Anyway, back to the point, Death of Slim Shady, one of my criticisms I felt like I was starting to have was that some of it feels like Eminem isn't prominent enough on a track, and I feel like that was something that was a major issue with Toby. I'm letting Toby off because it was kind of what I ended up expecting it to be, which was an outro track, which is why Eminem wasn't on it. It was his chance to pass the torch to two younger rappers from his area. So I sort of let Toby slide for that reason. I just don't think it should have been a single. That's probably where a lot more hate comes from it. And I feel like that's a good example of what I'm talking about in terms of the hooks. It's not an Eminem hook. Like, it's Big Sean or Baby Tron. I'm not gonna lie, their voices are so similar, I actually get lost between them. But like, there's an overuse of white gold in some elements, and some of those hooks, maybe Eminem would sound better on. Maybe there are cases where he wouldn't. That's not me saying white gold is bad at the hooks, that's just me saying that in some areas, maybe Eminem needs to be more of a centerpiece within those hooks, whether it's on the ad-libs, whether it's just feeling like he's a bit present there, because sometimes it feels like he appears, does his verse, turns around, has a fucking snack or whatever, then he finishes and he's like, oh crap, let me come back, do the other verse. Rather than him constantly being there, that's, I feel like, the best way I can describe what I'm trying to talk about in this. Any other criticisms? No. I genuinely like this album. And I gotta say, I like this album a lot. Now, the next kind of final conversation I want to have about this album is, I've seen this thrown around. Is this album on par or on the same tier as the Eminem Show? If you look at my Eminem tier list, you'll actually realise I have a bit of a different standpoint when it comes to the Eminem Show and where that regard is held compared to other people. But I am going to come at this like how people are talking about what the Eminem Show is ranked as. It's in his trilogy of best albums. It's in the conversation of best albums of all time. Does the Death of Slim Shady meet that? I'm not sure yet. I think the Eminem Show was a perfect product of its time, and I think timing is a massive thing of why albums stand out or why albums become a classic. Does the Death of Slim Shady meet an appropriate point in time? Arguably yes, arguably no. I think if you release this project in 2019, 2020, maybe you are talking about more of a classic. Because I don't personally think that whole idea of cancelling people, I don't know if that's really as a thing now. And I say that with hesitation as well there, so maybe it is more of a thing now, but I definitely think there was a point in time where almost anyone who was anyone was being cancelled. I feel like we're kind of on the other side of that, where it's almost a point where if you do something fucked up, you're getting cancelled, rather than just, you did this, we don't actually have all the context to it, you're getting cancelled. I don't think cancelling is as big of a thing now unless you actually do something fucked up. AKA, I think the biggest example of this actually relating to hip hop right now is Drake. He's almost being cancelled in his own way. The only difference is there's not that precise evidence saying, yes, you are doing what he's being accused of. But there's a lot of stuff to point at it, so I think in his own way, he is getting cancelled because people have noticed he's done fucked up shit. That's a different conversation that we probably shouldn't touch right now. Back to my kind of point, is the album of the Death of Slim Shady the right timing? I think it can be if we are on about that conversation of cancelling people, because it's still a prominent thing. I'm not saying cancelling isn't a thing that's like dead or anything, because it is a very prominent thing people will do, trying to cancel people for saying something stupid. I do actually agree that there is a place for cancelling people, because I think that idea of cancelling people is more of a thing where if you have done something fucked up that the police aren't going to get involved in, or legally it's technically not breaking laws, but you said something that's just wrong, I think there is a place for it. I just don't think it's ever handled correctly. I think this is too much of a different conversation that I'm getting away from in terms of speaking about, is the Death of Slim Shady the same level as the Eminem Show? It's all about timing. If it's going to be a classic and compared to what the Eminem Show was doing at its time is what I think I'm trying to get to. I think this is where I'll leave it. I kind of had to take a couple seconds there to think, but I think for now, the Death of Slim Shady is really good as an album. I think in a few months, in a year even, we have to then have that conversation of, is it on the same level as the Eminem Show? I think that's what I'm sort of staying at. However, the thing I will say right now, and maybe this is recency bias, but what I would agree with myself saying is, right now, the Death of Slim Shady is more replayable than the Eminem Show. That's just right now. That could change after a couple of months when the hype's died down a little bit and I'm like just coming back to it every like once in a while. Maybe because it's new, I'm listening to it too much. But I will say, I don't go back to the Eminem Show as often as other albums, like even Marshall Mathers LP. I would personally say, out of all three albums, even though I rank them differently, out of all three of the like top rated Eminem albums, Slim Shady LP, Marshall Mathers LP, and the Eminem Show, the Eminem Show is the one I listen to the least. And I could see myself listening to the Death of Slim Shady much more. And that's where I'll kind of park that conversation. Let's do the cheesy, tacky Anthony Fantino thing. What are we going to rate this? Right now, I'm going to rate it as an Eminem fan a 9 out of 10. If I'm coming at this from just like a musical standpoint and just like someone who just is a fan of music, I'd probably say an 8 out of 10. And almost to go back to that conversation actually, that's where I think the difference is going to be. To Eminem fans and stans, this is going to be a 9 out of 10 album. It's going to be on the level of the Eminem Show and Slim Shady and Marshall Mathers LPs. It's going to be on that level to them, I think. However, for that kind of more casual Eminem fans who are major fans of hip hop, if that makes sense, I think this is going to be looked at as an 8, maybe a 7. And for me, I'd say overall, I think it's a 9 as an Eminem fan. I think it's an 8 as just like a music hip hop fan. So for that reason, overall 8.5. Does the maths work there? Who gives a shit? It's a fucking great album. I wanted to get this video edited today and I'm going to try at some point, but I feel like I spoke a lot there. I want to hear your opinions now. Do you agree with anything I've said? Do you have any of your own thoughts that I didn't bring up? Let me know what you think of this project. I love it, and I'm going to go back to listening to it essentially in 5 minutes. I think there's a lot of conversation points you can bring up here. I would fucking love to do a podcast and speak about this, because I love speaking about Eminem and I love talking about his new album, and maybe there's someone else to bring up. This could be the last. I think it's definitely the last Slim Shady project we're going to get. Maybe there'll be a side B, maybe a deluxe, that would be nice. Personally, I would love to see it either say Resurrection or probably Rebirth, so then it kind of links into the RE stuff that Eminem does, Revival, Re-Up, Relapse, all that shit. I would like to see that. I think Eminem has one last big album he can push out, and I feel like it would be a Marshall Mathers LP3 or something like that, or maybe even King Mathers. Maybe we bring that title in here. You know what, actually, I'd fucking love that. Yeah, I'm putting that out here in the world. I'm manifesting this. I want Eminem to do his retirement project, and I want it to be called King Mathers, and he's hanging up the crown, or putting the crown up for someone else to take. I would like that as a project from Eminem. Plus, we could also get some of those tracks on a deluxe on there as like the bonus tracks or whatever, or even built into the album like A Brand New Dance was for the original King Mathers shit that wasn't added in there. Like, I think a King Mathers could be on the table if Eminem is thinking about doing one more project, that is, because this is almost a really good retirement project and a potential retirement project. I don't think it's quite there. I think we're opening the doors for a retirement project as his last thing. I think he's got one more in him. Then from there, I reckon he's going to go into features, and then probably focusing heavily on producing. I feel like that's where he's going to go. The only other thing I would want after those two things being a King Mathers retirement album and deluxe version for Death of Slim Shady, the only thing after that I would want is kind of like a compilation of just songs that didn't get dropped, because we know there's a lot of them out there, and I think a lot of fans would love to see some of the shit that wasn't put on, say, Encore, or what wasn't out on Relapse 2, or the songs that we didn't get from King Mathers. Like, there's that one featuring, I think it's 50 Cent and Jay-Z. I feel like there's someone else on there I'm missing, but there's a lot. So anyway, guys, I'm gonna leave it there. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe again. I've been Rodriguez-Dolman. I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Enjoy more listening of the album.